Okay, so welcome to our last video in this series, this lesson on the action potential. In this video, we're going to talk about the things that alter the threshold potential, and then we're going to talk about the things that alter the velocity of action potential propagation, which will be very similar things. And then we'll talk a little bit about EMGs, which will be very familiar to those of you who have already been through ECGs. They're basically the same thing, just for skeletal muscle and nerve. Okay? So let's start off with the threshold. Now, this is the membrane potential that's sufficient to produce an action potential. Here's what I mean by that. So this is an artificial experiment. Please don't worry about the details. Just look at it, take away what I'm describing, and take on faith that this is possible and this is what you can do. So what they did in this experiment was they took a neuron and they artificially generated increases in voltage in the membrane just through what they were doing. They were using a recording electrode and a stimulating electrode. Don't worry about that. Just they're increasing the voltage, all right? So you'll notice that if you increase the voltage a little bit, just a little bit, the voltage will go up, and then you stop increasing the voltage artificially and you just let the membrane do what it's going to do. It comes back down again, okay? And I can stimulate it a little bit more and get it to a higher voltage and then take that stimulus away so I'm not, holding it there anymore, and the membrane, let the membrane do what it wants to do, and it comes back down again. And if I increase it a little bit more and then take the stimulus away and let the membrane do what it wants to do, it goes down again. And then notice what happens at this point. We increase it a little bit more, and now look what happens. Instead of you increase it, you stimulate, and then you take the stimulus away, and you let the membrane do what it wants to do. Well, it turns out what it wants to do is keep depolarizing. And so instead of falling back down to rest, it goes up, and you hit threshold, and you generate an action potential. So this is the threshold potential. This is the voltage that you need to attain in order to throw an action potential, okay? Another way of saying that is that you guys know, you increase the voltage, you flip open those activation gates, you do it really quick, okay? Well, the more you increase the voltage, the more activation gates you flip and the more channels. And so eventually, if you flip enough activation gates and you open enough sodium channels, you get enough sodium coming in, and it'll cause enough of a depolarization in that membrane just adjacent to where you're at, to where you'll generate an action potential there, and you'll open more sodium channels, and you'll open more sodium channels, and so your voltage will continue to go up, and it'll propagate, okay? And that's what's happening here. You eventually get to the point where you flipped open enough activation gates all at once to where you get enough sodium coming in to where you start to get that regenerative reaction where the voltage goes up, more sodium channels flip open, the voltage goes up, etc. Okay? But that happens at a certain voltage, and that voltage varies with conditions, right? If I have a lot of open potassium channels at rest, those potassium channels are pulling me down toward -90 or -95. So the more of them are open, the more is pulling me down, and that means I have to open more sodium channels in order to overcome that. So the more potassium permeability you have, and the more chloride permeability you have in neurons, the more your voltage is dragged down toward either, in this case, for potassium, it's -95. In this case, it's the resting potential. Chloride in cells that spend the vast majority of their time at rest, like nerve and skeletal muscle, the ECL, the equilibrium potential for chloride, is actually the resting potential. So you guys know in cardiac muscle it was higher than that because cardiac muscle spends a third of its time depolarized. In this case, because you spend the vast majority of your time at rest, it's easy in nerve and potassium, in nerve and skeletal muscle, the chloride is at the resting potential, okay? So if you've got a bunch of open chloride channels and they're dragging you down toward rest, that means it's going to be hard for those sodium channels to depolarize your membrane. It's going to be hard to generate that regenerative reaction where sodium is continuing to come in and increasing the voltage enough to get your action potential here. So the more open chloride channels and potassium channels you have, the harder it is to get this regenerative reaction. And so we say that that means that the threshold potential is higher, or it's less negative, because in order to overcome this increased permeability, you have to open more sodium channels. The only way to open more sodium channels is to get to a higher voltage. So you get to a higher voltage, you flip open more activation gates. Eventually, you've done that enough to where you can overcome this. But the more of these channels are open, the more activation gates you have to flip and the higher voltage you have to get this action potential, okay? If I have a reduced number of sodium channels, that makes it harder to get that regenerative reaction. So let's say I depolarize my membrane and I go to -40. Well, if I have 1,000,000 channels, 20% of 1,000,000, that's pretty good. That's 200,000 channels. But if I have 10,000 channels, then 20% of 10,000 is 2,000. So that's 1% of what we had in the original condition when I had 1,000,000. So you're not opening as many channels when you depolarize the membrane, which means you have to depolarize it more to get enough open sodium channels to fire an action potential. So the more sodium channels you've blocked, the higher the voltage has to get before you get that regenerative reaction, because you need to open enough sodium channels, okay? So a lot of local anesthetics work this way. You guys probably know that. You block the sodium channels, you can't get an action potential, okay? The rate of depolarization, this is not as intuitive, but remember, the number of open channels is a competition between how many activation gates you flip open and how many inactivation gates you slowly flip closed, okay? So the key to flipping those activation gates open before the inactivation gates have a chance to close is to depolarize fast. If you do it fast, the activation gates, bam, they go. The inactivation gates are pretty slow. So the faster you depolarize, the bigger that period of time is before those inactivation gates begin to close. And so if you go fast, you'll open more sodium channels. If you go slow, then yeah, you'll gradually open activation gates, but you'll give those inactivation gates plenty of time to keep up, and so you won't open that many channels because there'll be too many of those channels with open activation gates that have closed inactivation gates. So the key is to get a bunch of open inactivation gates as quickly as possible, okay? And the way to do that is increase the membrane voltage as quickly as possible. So again, you know, it's a competition between the rate at which you open and the rate at which you close, okay? So if I depolarize really rapidly, I'm going to have a bunch of time in between when this happens and when this happens. If I depolarize slowly at like 1 millivolt per second, then yeah, I'll be gradually opening activation gates, but I'm going to be giving these inactivation gates plenty of time to keep up. And the net result is that you don't open that many sodium channels. And what you want here in order to achieve a threshold potential is to get a bunch of sodium channels open at once. So the faster you can depolarize, the lower the threshold potential and the easier it is to generate an action potential, okay? Action potential propagation actually depends on very similar things to the threshold in many ways. Do note that the amplitude and duration of the action potential is the same as it propagates through the membrane. So we're not talking about a decrement here. And do note that there is a refractory period, and that's why you have a unidirectional propagation. If an action potential just passed through this membrane, that means that it can't be stimulated. So an action potential can't propagate back this way. This membrane is refractory. It has to go forward into membrane that hasn't depolarized yet. So it's a unidirectional propagation down the membrane, okay? So things that increase the speed of propagation. Cell fiber diameter. The bigger the diameter of the cell, the faster the propagation. So if you think about cells that propagate action potentials really quickly, they're usually really big cells. Nerves are really big cells. Muscle cells are really big cells. If you remember, in the heart, Purkinje fibers are designed to propagate action potentials really fast. They're significantly larger than ventricular myocytes, which really are more designed to contract. Okay, and so they're bigger, so their Purkinje fibers propagate action potentials quicker. Okay, so that's the influence of cell diameter. Membrane resistance. What we mean by membrane resistance is resting membrane resistance, which means how many chloride channels and potassium channels do I have open? If I don't have many channels in that membrane, potassium and chloride, that means I have a high resting membrane resistance, and my action potential is going to propagate very fast because there isn't as much chloride and potassium dragging me down. So it's much easier to depolarize that membrane and get a propagation through it. If I have a whole bunch of open potassium and chloride channels, then we say we have a low resting membrane resistance. And what that means is that your propagation is going to be slower because your potassium and your chloride are going to be dragging you back down toward rest and toward the equilibrium potential for potassium. And so it's going to be harder for those sodium channels to depolarize the membrane. The propagation will be slower. Okay? Intracellular longitudinal resistance, all that is, it's the ease with which this cytoplasm conducts current. Okay? And this is fairly easy. You don't have to be an electrophysiologist to understand this. The cytoplasm itself doesn't vary a whole lot from cell to cell. So this value doesn't change much except where you have gap junctions in between cells in places like cardiac muscle and some smooth muscle. The more gap junctions you have, the lower the longitudinal resistance as the action potentials propagate from cell to cell. So if you have fewer gap junctions, or if your gap junctions aren't conducting ions very well, then that will slow your propagation from cell to cell. That's considered to be an increase in longitudinal resistance. If you have a whole bunch of gap junctions, then that's a decrease in longitudinal resistance, and the action potential will propagate from cell to cell much quicker. Okay? And the number of sodium channels, just like our threshold potential, the more sodium channels you have, the easier it is to fire an action potential in this membrane. And the easier it is to fire an action potential, the quicker that propagation is going to take place. So if you want to slow propagation, you block sodium channels and nerve and skeletal muscle, and it'll slow the propagation. Okay? And if you want to speed it up, you don't block them, you actually increase the number if you can, and that'll speed it up. Okay? And finally, the membrane capacitance, our old friend. This is how much charge you have to bring across the membrane, in the form of sodium in this case, in order to change the membrane voltage. If the capacitance is very low, then you don't have to bring much sodium across the membrane to change the voltage, and your propagation will be very fast. If your membrane capacitance is very high, then you have to bring a bunch of sodium across the membrane in order to change the voltage, and your propagation will be slow. So, we'll get to why that's relevant in a moment. Let's talk about subthreshold potentials. These are also called electrotonic potentials. Okay? This will become more significant when we talk about the synapses, but for right now, let's talk about its relationship to the velocity of action potential propagation. Okay? So these are potentials that don't hit threshold. Okay? And so an action potential, as you know, does not decrement. Same size, same duration, all the way across the cell. If you simulate the cell and it doesn't get to threshold, then what happens is the voltage will go up due to whatever is trying to make the voltage go up. Let's call it a synapse or whatever. But if you haven't opened enough sodium channels to fire an action potential, what happens is your voltage gradually comes back down again. Okay? And so if you measure the peak of that subthreshold voltage at a certain distance away from the point at which you tried to stimulate it, let's say the synapse, as you go further and further away, the peak goes down farther and farther until the action potential finally disappears. And out here at 4 millimeters away in this case, there is no action potential left. So your action potential propagated a little bit, but as it propagated, because it's not a real action potential, because it's subthreshold potential, it decremented and the peak went down. So at 1, it was down to probably half of what it was at 0. At 2, it was even less than half of that. And then at 4, it was down to 0, okay? So why is that important? Well, how big this peak is, any distance away from the stimulus, is determined by what's called the length constant, okay? You are not responsible for this equation or for any of the equations on this slide. It's simply there to sort of demonstrate to you how these things are measured, and it's a nice convenient, for those of you who are mathematically inclined, it's a nice convenient way to encapsulate many of the things that affect action potential propagation, and I'll explain that in a minute. So this length constant describes how this decrements, okay? If it's a large length constant, then that means that this thing's going to propagate farther away, okay? So if I have a large lambda, that means that my peak, instead of being at 56.3, it might still be up here. If it's a large lambda at 1 millimeter away, at 2, it might be up here, and you'll propagate farther away. These peaks will still go down, but they won't go down as much with distance. And the higher that lambda is, the faster your action potential will propagate in that membrane, okay? So a high length constant means fast action potential propagation. So why do you care? Well, the equation for the lambda is described here. A, in the numerator, the fiber diameter. Increase the fiber diameter, increase the length constant. Increased length constant means faster action potential propagation. We said that on the previous slide. Okay, this is just a mathematical representation. Rm is the resting membrane resistance. And the higher the resting membrane resistance, that is the fewer potassium and chloride channels we have that are open, the bigger the lambda and the faster the propagation. On the other hand, Ri is the longitudinal resistance. A high Ri slows the propagation down. We know that from the previous slide. It makes this length constant smaller. Smaller length constant means slower action potential propagation. So you don't have to memorize this, but for some of you, it will be convenient to remember this because this encapsulates many of the things that describe how action potentials propagate, what increases the propagation speed, what decreases the propagation speed, and that's very relevant to any of your neuro or pretty much any block where we describe excitable tissue, okay? So why do we care about capacitance? It's mostly because of myelin. You guys will recall that the thicker the membrane, the lower the capacitance, and now I've told you the lower the capacitance, the faster the propagation speed. Myelinated neurons have internodes, which are covered with myelin, and they have nodes of Ranvier in between the internodes, which are portions of neuron which are not myelin covered, okay? The internodes are generated by oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, Schwann cells, and the peripheral nervous system. And these literally wrap themselves around the neuron. And as they wrap themselves around the neuron and generate myelin, you generate this sheath in sort of like a jelly roll fashion. So this is what it looks like if you cut one of these internodes in half. You can see it here, okay? So this effectively thickens the membrane and makes it very, very thick, which means your action potential propagation speed across an internode is very, very fast. In fact, it's so fast, we basically don't call it propagation anymore. Note that in the nodes of Ranvier, we have a bunch of sodium and potassium channels. This is basically where they all are, effectively, okay? If there are any in here in the internodes, they're covered up, and they're not conducting much, if any, anything in the way of ions, okay? So this is where your action potential is actually generated, because this is where the sodium channels are, and then the potassium channels cause repolarization. So the speed of propagation across these internodes, due to the fact that your membrane thickness effectively is very high, and the density of your potassium channels and chloride channels is extremely low, which means our resting membrane resistance is very high. Those are conditions which add up to very fast propagation speed. And in fact, it's so fast we don't really even consider it to be conducting. We call it saltatory conduction because it literally appears to jump from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier. So you'll have your action potential that will propagate extremely fast, basically jump to the node of Ranvier. You'll open some sodium channels, you'll keep the action potential going. So it'll continue to propagate, and it'll jump to the next node, activate some sodium channels. And then your potassium channels here will cause the repolarization as it trails behind. This increases the speed of propagation a great deal. So myelinated fibers have very high action potential propagation rates. Non-myelinated fibers have fairly low propagation rates. So for instance, if you've ever put your hand on something hot, like a burner, heaven help you, you'll notice that you'll have put it down, but there was a very small delay before your reflex kicks in and you pick up your hand and you actually feel the pain. That delay is caused by the fact that the neurons that detect heat aren't myelinated. And so they don't conduct action potentials as fast as other neurons do. So there's a little delay there where you'll feel the heat eventually and you'll jump back and then you'll feel the burn. And the reason is because it takes those neurons longer to propagate the action potential than myelinated fibers. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about electromyography. This is going to be very familiar to you guys. You've been through the ECG. Here I have my electrical blob that I demonstrated in the video in the VFG block. My blob is negatively charged at rest on the inside of the cell and relatively positive on the outside of the cell, okay? Because we're at a negative voltage at rest, we're negative inside relative to positive here. So my cathode and my anode are both seeing positive charge here, and because they're both seeing the same thing, we have a flat output because it's basically zero. There's no difference between the two. If I begin to propagate from left to right in this cell, my anode starts to see some negative charge. My cathode is positive relative to my anode, and I get a positive deflection. If that propagation continues, then my anode sees even more negative charge, and my cathode is more positive relative to my anode, and I get a further positive deflection. And as you guys will remember, as this propagates over, eventually my cathode starts to see some negative charge. My cathode is less positive relative to my anode than it was when it was in this condition. And so we start to get a deflection that comes back down toward rest. And then eventually this entire fiber is depolarized. Both my cathode and my anode are seeing negative charge. And I'll be back down to rest again. So I kind of took that out again. You can go back and review the ECG video if you want. I didn't think it was really necessary. It's just necessary to remind you that these EMGs are like ECGs and that they're measuring the potential outside the cell. And it's the cathode relative to the anode. And as you propagate from anode to cathode, you get a positive deflection followed by a return back down to rest. And then as repolarization takes place, you actually get a negative deflection, and it'll return back up toward where it started, okay? That was just a very brief review, just to remind you guys of how it works. I don't think it's necessary to go into a whole lot more detail than that. If anybody wants you to use them, they'll describe it, and you need more detail, you'll get more detail at that point, okay? All right, I believe that's all I have. It is. Thank you for your attention, and I'll talk to you soon.